Olá, boa tarde. O meu nome é Diana Combo e sou programadora de música e de artes sonoras do Teatro do Bairro Alto. E, antes de mais, quero-vos dar as boas-vindas à conferência do nosso convidado Ana Nagoski. Esta conferência faz parte do nosso período de programação prévia, o Quase Teatro do Bairro Alto, que está a acontecer em vários espaços da cidade próximos do teatro, que fica aqui ao lado, para quem não sabe. É uma série consiste numa série de performance, site-specific e algumas conferências. As conferências vão acontecer aqui, no Centro de Amadores de Balé, a Fundação Maria Madalena de Melo. Aproveito também para agradecer por nos receberem aqui tão bem. E agradeço também à equipa da qual eu sou parte e a todas as pessoas e todas as casas que tornam possível o Quase Teatro do Bairro Alto. Esta conferência está a ser transmitida por streaming através da nossa página de Facebook e do Twitter, se não estou em erro. E aproveito também, antes de começarmos, para vos dizer que o Ian estará aqui para responder a qualquer pergunta ou curiosidade dos presentes ao vivo e a cores, e também para quem estiver a assistir por streaming. Se tiverem alguma pergunta, podem fazer e nós colocamos a pergunta ao Ian no final da apresentação dele. Eu não vou fazer uma apresentação melhor que o Ian fará dele próprio, até porque eu já me enganei na folha de sala, disse que ele estaria a regressar a Lisboa quando até é uma estreia. Portanto, é melhor não dizer mais nada. Vou passar a palavra ao Ian. E a vocês espero ver-vos mais vezes nas nossas futuras apresentações. Obrigada.
Hi. Hola. My name is Ian Nagoski. I'm from the United States. I don't speak anything other than English. I'm sorry. Typical stupid American. I'm not well educated. I'm very, very fortunate to be here. Thank you. I'm here because I like old records, like a lot. About 20-something years ago, I started digging around in early 20th century recordings that were laying around in heaps. We in the United States have not had a war in a long time, since before there were records. And we produce a lot of junk. And it sits around, and nobody knows what to do with it, and eventually gets thrown into garbage heaps. And because I was so poorly educated, I've discovered that I was able to learn everything I needed to know about the world by digging around through old junk and trying to find out what it was. One of the things I found, digging around in this old junk, were a lot of records made in languages other than English. And because I only read and speak English, I thought, well, it would be interesting to know what's on these records. And in that way, over the course of 20-odd years, I found out a lot of stuff that my people don't talk about, that we don't know. So I'm here tonight to tell you a story that I've been working on for 12 years. There is too much to say. I will not be able to tell you and share with you everything I want to, but I'll try my best to get through as much as I can. It's a story about America and immigration. We have a serious situation regarding immigration in the United States right now. It is upsetting on a daily basis. And in order to understand what's going on, we need to know, as Americans, what happened. And it doesn't get taught in schools. There isn't any part of our education, our history, that includes the actual story of immigration to the United States. And so we now find ourselves in a situation where evil forces, and make no mistake, they are evil, who are using immigrants as scapegoats in our country right now, are able to swindle the public because the public doesn't know what happened. So, several things I need to do. I need to tell you first and foremost that what this is for me is fun. I love old books and old records. Always have. Because I love learning, and there's joy and discovery and wonder everywhere, every day for me. There's always something new. And to share it, to play it for other people and tell the stories is so fun. So, that's first. The second thing is that I believe that musicians are good. They're good people doing a good thing, always, always, always. No one is ever doing anything bad when they're playing music or listening to music. It's always wonderful. And musicians themselves are such small people in the world. They're blown like leaves through the whirlwind of time, as Hannah Arendt described Adolf Eichmann. Musicians are subject to these great forces of history, and they are dedicated to expression. So they're good people to look at when you're looking at what's going on historically in the world. And the third thing that's important to me is to address my country and to talk about who we are and what we've done and to try and help us. Notice that I am not there telling this story. I am here because my people don't want to hear this. It's true. Americans have been so ambivalent about the idea of immigration for so long that this is all as foreign to them as it is to you. So, before I get around to playing you some records, I'm first going to give you just a little quick crash course that I learned myself in order to give context to these old, musty, dusty, crusty 78 RPM discs that I've been absorbed by for a couple of decades now. The rule was to get into the United States immediately after the Constitution came about, that if you got into the United States, you were American. Simple. 5 years later, after they passed the Constitution, they said, no, you have to be here for 5 years before you can be a citizen and vote. This first Immigration Act was there for the same purpose as every other piece of legislation that immigration has always been about. It is about power and who gets to vote. When do you get to be one of us? Has always been the question. And that question is always, when do you get a say in what our representative democracy does? It's the whole thing, power. Always has been. There were little local laws. I live in a port city called Baltimore, where the law was in 1830 that if a ship pulls in and just dumps a lot of old, infirm, familyless people onto the coast of the city, the sailor of the ship, the captain of the ship, would be fined an astronomical sum. This law was put there because mayors in England were just rounding up all of the public wards, all of the people who were sick or old, putting them on ships and just paying the ship's captain, here's £5, get rid of this guy for me. And they're just dumping them on the streets of Baltimore. So, land of opportunity. Then, this massive couple of waves of immigration happened in the middle of the 19th century. The first wave is the largest. 5 million people in 40 years come who speak German. So they're not English, they're Germans. Okay, that's different. Now we have, to this day, where I live, a group of religious zealots who live exactly like they did 200 years ago without electricity, who never assimilated into American culture at all. And they speak German. They're called the Amish. So, if you find yourselves worried whether religious zealots will come and not assimilate and not learn to speak your language, I can tell you, it may not be a problem, actually. They may be very nice. Sure, they have horse-drawn carriages, and it's annoying zipping around them in your car, but they may be okay. Anyway. And the other big wave of immigration, 3 million people came over the course of 40 years from Ireland. Okay, here we run into a very serious problem because they were Catholic. And the power establishment were all Protestant. So now, are we actually going to let these papists vote? Are they going to be included in us, in what we do, and what legislation, our power, our money? Do they get a say in all this? Seems not a good idea. So what winds up happening is a political party is created called the Native American Party. It was also called the Know-Nothings. And the Know-Nothings started hiring street gangs to go around at election time and beat up the Irish immigrants, beat up the Catholics. In Baltimore, the names of the street gangs included the Plug Uglies, the Rough Skins, the Rip Raps, the Blood Tubs. The deal with the Blood Tubs was in Pigtown in Baltimore. They would get a tub of blood from the butcher shop and dump it over the head of an Irish immigrant and then chase him down the street with knives to intimidate the voters on election day. This is what will happen to you if you try to vote in our election, right? So there were riots, 4 years running in Baltimore. And this way, the Native American Party, which was a party that ran on a nativist platform, won elections 4 years in a row, including a presidential election in the middle of the 19th century. 1870, we pass an amendment to the Constitution which gives full citizenship rights to black men, the right to vote, shortly after the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery in the United States. One of the purposes of that amendment, those two amendments, the 14th and 15th, was to create a situation in which voters were enfranchised. They were able to vote and not be intimidated, as in the case of like the Blood Tubs or the Ku Klux Klan, who were also founded as a voter intimidation organization, basically. 1882, the US passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first time that the United States ever said that there was a group of people who we didn't want, that could not come and become part of the United States, become American citizens. It specifically, by ethnicity, by nationality, said, you can never be us. It's impossible. The argument was that Chinese are pagans and they are monarchists by culture, and that's never going to change. They're never going to assimilate, and there's a whole country, we're going to break a treaty with China over trade just to pass this act so we can say definitively, you're out. We don't want you. And this, my friends, is where the trouble really begins. This is where we begin to be a culture that is screaming at each other about who gets in and who gets out. It just so happens that 1882 is also right about when sound recording is invented. A German immigrant in Washington, D.C., Emil Berliner, invents disc recording shortly after Edison sets up cylinder recording in New Jersey. And music starts being recorded in the United States by people who have arrived lately and speak languages other than English. And this is the beginning of the period that I begin running into all these recordings. The area that I got particularly fascinated by was recordings made in Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Armenian that I found lying around in heaps. Now, I didn't know anybody growing up who spoke Turkish, Armenian, Greek, Syrian, or Arabic. So at first I wondered maybe these were, recorded for some scholarly use. Maybe these were some intellectual wanted to hear what music from other parts of the world were. No, that is not the case at all. These records that I was finding in junk heaps were the detritus, the leftovers of immigrants who had arrived. And I needed to know how and why this happened, and how and why, when I walked into a record store, there wasn't still anything in Turkish or Arabic or Armenian or Greek. So I'll begin by telling you that that the recording of no. I got a better one. So there's this huge wave of immigration that happens from the last decade of the 19th century up to 1924. Big wave from Europe, almost entirely from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. About a third of them are Eastern Europeans, Slavs, Ashkenazi Jews. Lots and lots of people from Southern Italy. 90,000 Portuguese arrived between 1900 and 1920. During that period, a big wave of people came from the collapsing Ottoman Empire. Between 1891 and 1893, 33,111 immigrants arrived from Ottoman territories. 1899 to 1914, 373,939 arrived from Ottoman territories. So 10 times as many in the decade that follows the last decade of the 19th century. The vast majority of them are Christians and Jews, 80%, 85%. Only about 200,000 Muslims arrived in the United States between 1820 and 1920, over a century. America has been inhospitable to Muslims for a very long time. It's just true. The vast majority of the Muslims who arrived were Turks. The vast majority of those came to make money, did, and then went home, got married, went on with their lives. Practically, a tiny minority remained in the US past the point that they had enough money to get married. The same was true for Greeks. They came for a little while to get married and then leave. The absolute height of immigration in the history of the United States happens in 1907. There were, at that time, 1,000 people a day arriving through simply one port in the United States, through Ellis Island. Of many ports in the US, 1,000 people a day from all over the world were coming in just to that one port of entry. In 1903, at the base of the Statue of Liberty, on the next island over from Ellis Island, on Liberty Island, the base of the Statue of Liberty, we mounted a brass plaque with a poem on it, a sonnet, written by a woman named Ana Lazarus. Maybe you know it. It's called The New Colossus. The second stanza of that sonnet goes, "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she. "With silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." 1903, America still had that attitude. We were still in our right minds. We were still basing our identity, Walt Whitman said, a nation of nations, of welcoming in whoever needed to come. And when you go to Ellis Island, there is graffiti in every language. There is Old Turkish Ottoman script, there is Portuguese, there is Polish and Russian and Hebrew and tons of stuff scattered all over the place. Now, do you know where Ana Lazarus was from? She was a Sephardic Jew who, her family had been in New York City since the 17th century, for 100 years. They had fled her ancestors fled 100 years before her from Brazil, where her family of Portuguese and Spanish Jews fled from Brazil as refugees from a Dutch colony when the Portuguese took over that section of Brazil. They themselves were refugees who had been refugees from here. That's who wrote that poem. So I will bring in little bits and pieces of Portugal as I find them. So, and so her family became wealthy parts of the mainstream of America. Her granduncles, in fact, were friends with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who were among the founding fathers of the United States, people who fought in the American Revolutionary War and were foundational people in the writing of the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So she's right there in the mainstream of the United States. Okay, time for the first record. I'm going to put you right in the middle of 1920 in the United States. And this is not a song by immigrants, this is a song about immigrants. After this wave of 30 years of 1,000 people a day coming in through Ellis Island and this huge influx of Slavs and Orthodox and Catholics, all these new kinds of people coming into the United States, Americans were getting weird about the whole thing. It was starting to feel strange to get onto the subway and see these people and their foreign languages and their foreign dress and their dark eyes and their brownness. Started to feel uncomfortable, to the extent that in 1920, Nora Bayes, who was a big pop star, she had a massive hit that's still well known about the First World War, Over There, Over There. Nora Bayes records a song called The Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. It was re-recorded a number of times in the next 2 years. Eddie Cantor recorded it in 1921. This version is by the Duncan sisters, who were the actual sisters. They were a big vaudeville act. One was in blackface, one wasn't. And they played this like black girl, white girl thing, this Topsy and Eva from Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of characters. And they recorded the Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. They accompany themselves on an instrument that also originates from here, the ukulele, via Hawaii. And I'm just going to play it for you. If you can't understand the words, don't worry. I'll try and explain it a little later. But yeah, it's fun. Full of anxiety, but fun.
Discovered America in 1492. Then came the English and the French, the Scotsman and the Jew. Then came the Dutch and the Irishmen to help the country grow. And still they keep on coming, and now everywhere you go, there's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. One sells a paper, the other signs a tune, the other takes a whiskers off his teeth. And when you ride again on a subway train, notice who has all the seats. Ah, they're all held by the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. Now there's a little flat where you hang your hat, has an history I'll explain. The janitor's Irish, the hallboy is a coon, the elevator fellow is a Dane. But who is the gent that collects the rent at the end of each 4 weeks? Ah, that is all done by the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. There's the Oldsmobile and the Hotmobile and the Cadillac and the Ford. Now these are the motors that you and I can own, the kind most anybody can afford. But the Cunningham and the Mercedes and the Rolls-Royce racing freaks, ah, they're all owned by the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. Now there's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. They don't know the language, they don't know the law, yet they both in the country of the free. And the funny thing, when we start to sing, my country is of thee, none of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. Now there's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. When we're departed, our souls will soar up the at the Golden Gate, where the angels wait, we'll be asking there for a seat. And they'll all be reserved by the Argentines, and the Portuguese, and the Greeks. Is that all right?
Okay, so several things. There were no Argentines. Argentina, nobody left Argentina. The end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Argentina was seeing its own massive wave of inward immigration. So Argentina was just a word that the writers used to indicate generally Spanish-speaking people. And it sounded right. And maybe it was a little nicer than saying Mexicans or something. Portuguese, yes. 90,000 Portuguese, as I said. Most of them immigrated to Connecticut and Massachusetts. I believe that's why my flight here was from Boston, actually. My sisters, where they live in Massachusetts, there's Portuguese on the radio to this day. And the Greeks. Now, they don't know the language, they don't know the law. Now, they vote in the land of the free. But the funny thing, when we start to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee," none of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. It's ambivalent. Now, there are other versions of this song that are, including Nora Bay's version and another version by a guy named Ed Meeker, that are much more xenophobic and clear about it. The Ed Meeker version includes a line accusing the immigrants of just alcoholism. They all love their liquor. They don't give a nickel for the stuff that runs in rivers, brooks, and creeks. This is during Prohibition, when liquor is illegal. So he's saying they're, addicts and criminals, basically. And both the Meeker version and the Nora Bay's version include verses of sexual anxiety. What if these people are better in sex than I am? So the Ed Meeker version includes the verse, "I'm in love with the sweetest girl loves me. I love to dine in the club cafe, paraffin and wine. My girl has a different grade, and she just loves to dine with the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. He loves to rummage down among the garlic, and her breath will not be over when she speaks. Now the thing I dread is the year we're wed, our child has made 3 weeks. It will look like the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks." Paraffin is a word in English you may not know. I didn't know what it was. It's used in making candles. It is a thin, white, viscous fluid. He could have said candle wax, but paraffin is what he meant. So, Greeks had actually been in the Americas for way longer than Edward Meeker's people. Greeks began settling in North America the middle of the 16th century. 1592, the first Greek coffee house opens in New England, opened by a guy named Canopius, who was from Crete. Beginning of the middle of the 17th century, Greeks established themselves in Florida, New Orleans, Alaska. Early 19th century, President James Monroe and Congress supported Greeks' war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. 1857, Spiros Bazanos opens the Peloponnesus, the first Greek restaurant in New York City. That same year, Nicholas Pappas was the first Greek man in Chicago. In 1858, only 2 Greeks arrived in the United States. Now, Armenians first began to immigrate to the United States 1618. In 1870, there were fewer than 70 Armenians in the US. By 1890, there were 3,000. Between 1894 and 1917, 54,000 Armenians arrived. We're going to have to talk about why that was. We're not going to do that right now. And then another 30,000 Armenians arrive between World War I and 1924. Why 1924? Why is that the date I keep using? Because of another act of legislation. In 1924, America passed the Johnson-Reed Act. The Johnson-Reed Act was a set of quotas for how many people could come from each nation on Earth. The purpose of the quotas was to keep the country exactly the color white that it had been up to 1880. It used 1880 census data to establish the numbers of who could come from where. The point of the whole thing was to reset the ethnicity and culture of the United States back 30 years before the large wave of Slavs and Southern Europeans and Middle Easterners and all these other people had come, to make us white again. So the quotas said, at the time, every year, 51,272 Germans could arrive, 34,007 from Great Britain and Northern Ireland, 5,982 from Poland, 3,845 from Italy, 503 from Portugal, 120 Armenians a year, 100 each from Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Bulgaria, Greece, Palestine, Albania. The number of Asiatics and Africans allowed in per year from 1924 until the bill was repealed in 1965 was zero. Zero. Nobody from Asia or Africa. So, if you were born as a baby boomer, let's say, after the Second World War, 1946, 47, let's say the generation of the current president, you grew up in the least ethnically diverse America that ever existed. You grew up in the whitest America. You grew up in the most monolingual America that ever existed. That's what you think America should be. When Johnson Reed is taken away in 1965, all these more people start arriving from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, more and more through the 70s, 80s, lots of people from South America coming. You get to be middle-aged. You get to be 40, 50, 60 years old, and you're looking around and you're going, this is not the America that I grew up in. This is not the America that we fought for. This is not the America that I know and love. Because you grew up in the most racist, backward America that we ever allowed. You grew up in a place that we should be ashamed of. But nobody knows that. It's not taught in school. It's not general knowledge. I wouldn't have known if I didn't need to know about these stupid records that were left behind as trash. So, in order for Johnson Reed to be passed, there needed to be consensus within the public. So 1920, the Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks is a hit song that is already part of a cultural wave of people becoming more anxious about immigration. That anxiety is being fueled by scientists and experts. I'll take, for example, Harry H. Laughlin, who was born 1880 in Iowa, educated in Missouri, got a PhD from Princeton. Harry H. Laughlin's entire career was in going around to prisons and mental hospitals and doing demographic studies of the ethnicities of the inmates in order to prove that these new immigrants, these browner people from South Europe and Eastern Europe, were vastly more inclined toward criminality and insanity than anyone else. He spoke in front of Congress 4 times in 4 years at immigration hearings and convinced our government that this was true. And it's in this way that the culture and power was able to shut down the influx of more people and to create a society that believed that there was something wrong and inferior with new people from these other places that weren't WASPs, that weren't Protestants. So, and his basic argument is, okay, I'm just gonna read you a quick part of one of his books. It's called Conquest by Immigration from 1939. Immigration to the nation is closely comparable with marriage of a youth of the family. Neither is a thing to be determined primarily for immediate position or economic advance. In the long run, both for the family and the nation, the addition, the acceptance of the outside individual should depend on hereditary stuff, physical, mental, and moral, out of which the newly added group member is made. So, his basic argument, when it comes down to it, after all the mathematical models and statistics, is you don't want your daughter to marry one. What happens with Johnson Reed is that all of these immigrants who have come, if you're from one of these browner places, your family can't come anymore. And it separated families. It broke up people's lives. It broke up people's communication, and it destroyed their cultural sense of themselves as connected to back home. So, I'm going to play you a record that was made by a guy named Nishan Keljekian. It's called Uske Gukas. Keljekian was born July 1886, arrived at Ellis Island November 13th, 1911, age of 25, from Presede Elazig, eastern Anatolia, 200 miles north of Aleppo, Syria. Keljekian joined his brother in Chelsea, Massachusetts, worked first as a barber and then as a land surveyor for the city of Medford, Mass., and finally he owned a mortuary. He only recorded 6 songs. This song is the only song in Armenian I have ever heard, and I have heard thousands now, that is a direct protest to anything at all. And it's a direct protest to Johnson Reed. It's called Where Do You Come From? And the lyrics go, Oh, my America, open the closed door. My fiancé is still on the other side. Although I have a piece of bread, my mouth is dry, my eyes wet. Where did you come up with this quota? Why are we here? We are here, but where will they go? What home do we have? What income? We are left, dazed and lost. Oh, my America. Are you the only one that doesn't get it? The Armenian language isn't going to harm you. When we start to speak broken Armenian, the melting pot is already ready for us. You sent money and missionaries, and you made us so porod. Porod is Armenian slang. It's a slur against Protestants. It sounds like leper in Armenian. Come and be of aid to us. We are not foreign to you. record business stuff. Let's get into the nerd stuff. This is fun. So, the first recordings made of people in Arabic and Turkish in the United States were done not for public consumption. They were made in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair by an academic named Benjamin Ives Gilman. September 25th, 1893, 8:45 in the morning at the Turkish Pavilion, the Turkish Theater, at a World Exposition. There were, at the Chicago World's Fair, there was a Turkish pavilion, an Algerian one, an Egyptian one, and he went and recorded on cylinders for academic use material of various other ethnicities, a lot of Fijian stuff and a lot of Javanese stuff and a bunch of Northwestern Indian stuff. He records 7 cylinders by a group of Arabic-speaking performers, and then another 7 by Turkish-speaking performers. 2 men, one playing oud, another playing violin, a woman playing tambourine, another playing drum. The notes mention that one of the drum players was a, quote, dancer, well known at the fair as a star of Constantinople or some other locality. So she may have been one of the dancers who performed under the name Little Egypt. Or she might have been Farida Mazar Syropoulos, who was born 1871, the Syrian wife of a Greek merchant from Chicago. She might have been Mademoiselle Rosa was another dancer. But she might have been this woman that we don't know much about, who was Little Egypt. Little Egypt was the big breakout star of the entire exposition because she did this dance, the hoochie coochie dance, it was called. It's what we now call belly dancing. Apparently, her performance gave Mark Twain a heart attack. She was very good, and she was a huge star. The song that she danced to, everyone where I live knows, even though nobody knows where it comes from. It's called the Streets of Cairo, and it goes, maybe you know it. Na, 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 na. Right, Streets of Cairo. Streets of Cairo was written by a guy named Saul Bloom, who was a Jew from Indiana, who was raised dirt poor. He only went to school one day of his life. He goes into business as a teenager, buying and selling. He's a huckster. He's selling medicated window screens. It's a total scam. But he makes a ton of money, so that by the time he's 19 years old, he's already very nearly a millionaire. Such that he has enough money to blow to take a steamship and go see the Paris World Exposition for fun by himself. And there, at the Paris World Exposition, he sees a troupe of Algerian dancers, women from Algeria dancing in France in the end of the 19th century in front of a Jew from Indiana, and he thinks to himself, oh my God, I'm gonna make $1 million on these women. I'm going to bring them to America, and it's going to destroy people's minds. So he comes back to the US. He's trying to figure out, like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to get over on this? And he figures it out. He gets a job as the entertainment director, making more than the President of the United States, running all the entertainment, sets up these Algerian dancers to come to the entertainment thing, and he improvises the Streets of Cairo himself on the piano as the song that they will dance to. Huge breakout hit. It's in all American cartoons whenever a character comes on screen, and it's, you need a musical shorthand to indicate that something is from the Middle East. There's a place in France where the naked ladies dance. There's a hole in the wall where the boys can see it all. Is the schoolyard dirty version that I knew when I was 7 years old. Everybody knows a version where I'm from. Anyway, so then there's no more recording of anybody from the Middle East until 1912. By 1912, the 2 major US recording studios are up and active. Since 1900, they've been going. Victor Records and Columbia Records. Victor Records has its main studio in Camden, New Jersey, but then other studios in New York City. Columbia's main studio is in what was then the tallest building in the world, the Woolworth Building on Broadway. And both companies were looking at the immigrant situation, these 1,000 people a day, and going, can we get some money out of these people? Can we sell them something? And so they begin to work out arrangements with other companies in the countries of origin of all these immigrants, and they start importing discs to sell to the immigrants, and the immigrants will buy them. It works. In fact, by the mid-teens, there's already a big scam going on where scam artists are putting ads in foreign language newspapers saying, records of your native land in your native tongue, and a record player to play them on. $5 down, and we'll deliver the record player to your house with your own country's music, and then you make easy payments over time. Think how wonderful. You can hear again the songs from home. And so the deal was with the scam, guy, express delivery, this big piece of furniture to play the records on, big gramophone machine. Guy shows up at your house with this giant box, and the delivery man is told, what you have to do is you have to tell them they have to pay the whole balance. And nobody's got that kind of money. Nobody can afford it. It's $1,000, $2,000 for one of these things. So you go, oh, sorry, the company told me I got to take the record player away. So this one scam artist got caught doing this. He had defrauded people to the tune of $3 million in contemporary money. And when he was convicted of fraud, his fine was $70,000. So he made out like a bandit on the nostalgia that the immigrants felt, on the need to connect to home, of their strandedness, their distance, their being within this new place that made not that much sense. So immigrants in the US are being sold recordings from back home, and then the companies go into the communities and try to record immigrants that they think might be saleable to the immigrant communities. And mostly what they record, because they are A&R men, music business people, they record bland, middle-class, aspiring performers, people with trained voices. And what happens is those records don't really sell very well. Turns out, what all these rural bumpkins from all over the world want to hear is down-home, funky, raw folk music like they came from. They want to hear their village. They want to hear the wedding song. They want to hear what they remember. So then, the companies finally get it through their heads. Go ask, is there anybody in your community who plays the fiddle like you remember back home? And then we start getting this huge wave in the 19-teens and 20s of recordings of people from all over the world who just came in off the boat to the United States. And because this is happening with Poles or Bohemians or Italians or whatever, smaller ethnic groups are arriving at the record company offices and saying, you didn't record us yet. What's the matter? We count too. We belong on records, just like everybody else. One of the people that does this is a guy named M.G. Parzekian, an Armenian guy. He shows up at Columbia Studios 1912 and says, I got a band. Parzekian has already been in the importing-exporting business, importing records from Beirut, Constantinople, and Cairo to sell to the immigrant communities. But he's got these 3 Armenian guys and 1 Assyrian guy, and he says, I need to record these guys, and people will buy it. And Columbia says, fine, it'll cost you 2 weeks' wages, basically, and we'll do it. So they put out this series of recordings that are the first in Turkish for the American immigrant community. I'm going to play you one by one of the guys that recorded at that first group of sessions in 1912. This is the Assyrian guy. His name is Khosrow Malul. He was born 1881 in Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey, immigrated to the US 1904, married an Armenian. He worked first at a silk mill, later at a tailor shop, living at various addresses in Queens and northern New Jersey until his death in 1971. First records October 1912. This is a recording from 1916. It is one of the first 3 recordings in the Kurdish language made in the United States. There were recordings in Kurdish in the US 4 years before any black woman made a record in the US. Mamie Smith did not record Crazy Blues until the middle of 1920. So here we have it. Just a little bit of America. And I play this one for you particularly because it includes the word America. By the way, I do this all the time. We should all be comfortable. That's the most important thing. It should be fun. So if you're hot or you're bored or you need to clear your head or something, get up, move around. It's fine. You won't hurt my feelings. Please be free, okay? It's just important that you know that. All right. So look, about 10 years ago, 2008 happened. I got broke. I came back from my first tour of Europe, and I had no job, and the crash had happened. I had to go drive a cab. Most of the cab drivers where I lived in Baltimore were Nigerian. And I asked one of the Nigerian cab drivers, why are there so many Nigerian cab drivers in Baltimore? And he said to me, because once there was one Nigerian cab driver in Baltimore. And he was exactly right. So there's a great book by a woman named Linda K. Jacobs, just came out a couple of years ago, called Strangers in the West, the Syrian Colony of New York, 1880 to 1900. And she gave a lecture at the Library of Congress about the first Syrian family to arrive in the US. It's an amazing hour-long talk just on that one family. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. They were the Arbeelys. Yusuf Arbeely was born 1828, 5 miles outside of Damascus. July 1878, he, his wife, 6 sons, and a niece all arrive in New York City. Now, America, the only thing they know about Damascus or Syria is from the one book that everybody has in their house. They only know it's the Holy Land. And these people are from the Holy Land. No idea. There's no way. What is that like? Who are they going to be? Totally exotic. So they arrive in New York City. There's a bunch of reporters at the port asking them questions. And it turns out they speak English beautifully. He's a doctor. They're very well educated, very well mannered. And the newspapers say, like, oh my God, Syrians are great. These people are amazing. And they're from, like, where Jesus was from. Can you believe it? So they immediately get a job doing medical work in Shelbyville, Tennessee, in the Great Smoky Mountains, where bluegrass is from, the heart of country music. Mountain country, hillbillies, God, guts, and guns. That's where the first Syrians moved to. And apart from their medical work, they take on another job, which is that they start touring, giving shows where you could pay 20 cents and you can go into a tent and you can see people from the Holy Land dressed up like Ottoman citizens with a rug and a water pipe. There they are. Oh my God. All the boys are, like dressed in drag, and veils and stuff to look like women. They made money. He made the equivalent, when he died, he left behind $6,000 in cash, which is $150,000 today, along with a bunch of stocks in railroads and vineyards. They did fine, the American dream. And one of the sons was seen by the President of the United States at one of these events in Washington, D.C. He gets a job as the ambassador to Jerusalem. They send him to Jerusalem with business cards saying ambassador. Jerusalem was still Ottoman territory, and the Ottoman officials go, no, you're still an Ottoman citizen. You can't possibly be ambassador from the United States. No, you will always be Ottoman. So they send him home, but for the rest of his life, he had that business card, appointed by the president, So a couple of the sons die, a couple of them move back to Cairo. Two of them go, one of them goes into business, marries a very wealthy real estate developing family in California, and with his brother starts the first Arabic language newspaper in America, 1870 something. And in this newspaper, and the other brother is an interpreter at Ellis Island, interpreting from Arabic and other languages for the immigrants. In their newspaper that they start publishing weekly in the US, they are actively sending these newspapers back to the home country, trying to bring more people in, advocating to create colonies of Arab people in the US. And it works. So that's how we wind up with Syrian colonies in Wisconsin. And in La Crosse, Wisconsin, it's a great long story. Anyway, I'm going to play you a guy that was one of the members of the Syrian colony of Lower Manhattan. There was a little Syria 5 blocks from where the World Trade Center was. When they excavated the site of the World Trade Center after 9/11, the oldest thing they found underneath was the keystone from the former Maronite church. A strip of Washington Street had been Little Syria for decades. And everybody was displaced, moved across to Brooklyn, around Atlantic Avenue. After a bridge was built, they had to get rid of that street. But for decades, there was a strip of fez-wearing, water pipe-smoking Ottoman citizens. There were 2 record labels that operated off of Washington Street in Little Syria. One was run by a Copt named A.J. Maksud. He put out wonderful stuff. And the other was run by a guy named Alexander Malouf. Malouf was second generation. Malouf was born in the US sometime between 1884 and 1887. And the thing about Malouf's music and his record label is that it was second generation, hybridized, assimilated Arab American music. The first recording made for an Arabic-speaking audience in the United States was made in 1913. And I'm going to play it for you. It's a piece called Al Jazair, which just means Algeria. It's a song that's still danced to in southern Turkey and northern Greece, Kurdistan. It's still a big, popular song. And it refers to the Ottoman military campaigns hundreds of years ago in Algeria. But here it is played by a second-generation Syrian in New York City in 1913 in a piano style that is not that different from a kind of proto-ragtime. His intention was always to make a Americanized Arab music. His record label put out these band arrangements. I have with me, he recorded an 8-minute song called America Ya Hilwa, America the Beautiful, a national anthem in Arabic in 1920 in New York City. Then things got hard. Oh, he'd already published sheet music, by the way. He had a song called A Ticklish Sensation, another song called The Egyptian Slide. He was a working professional musician, and when things got hard in the Depression in the 30s, he goes to Richmond, Indiana, records at Genet Studios a bunch of specific discs for unusual markets, not for an immigrant market. There was one series that he made specifically for roller rinks, and another series of discs he made playing organ for funeral parlors. He's a working musician. Tours all over the place, dies in Los Angeles in the 1970s. All right, Al Jazair. America had one of the greatest violinists in the history of recorded music for decades. And there are about 6 people on earth right now who care about this guy, know who he is. His name is Naim Karakand. I love Naim Karakand. I was taught to love Naim Karakand by a friend of mine who was his family were Aleppan Jews that arrived and settled in northern New Jersey. He gave me my first Karakand record, and his name's Steve Shapiro, and I have him to thank for getting obsessed with this story. So, quickly, the Karakand story is, Karakand was a guy from Aleppo. He was Catholic, immigrated alone at 19 years old in 1909. He was born 1891. Comes through Ellis Island, lives in Brooklyn by himself in a boarding house full of Syrians. Starts recording for Columbia in 1916. His style immediately is almost identical to the style of a guy named Sami El Shawa. Does anybody know Sami El Shawa by any chance? Sami El Shawa is the most famous violinist of the Arab world of the entire 20th century. There's a big retrospective, like 10 CD box set that came out not too long ago. Sami El Shawa was from Aleppo, moves to Beirut and then Cairo, winds up playing with Zaki Murad, Abdul Hayy Hilmi, Yusuf El-Manilawi, all the big Tarab stars of Egypt in the 19 teens and 20s. He's a master. Sami El Shawa is born 1890 in Aleppo, and his style is almost exactly identical to Naim Karakhan's, his style and his repertoire. Samuel Shawa goes to Beirut and Cairo, becomes celebrated as this great star who's still remembered as biographies, and nobody remembers Naim Karakhan because Naim Karakhan came to the United States, who could care less about immigrants and their weird old backward ways and their hillbilly weirdness. So he winds up being house fiddler through the 1920s for A.J. Maksud's label in Little Syria in New York. Accompanies a lot of really good singers, Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, all kinds of styles. And then he disappears. And for 10 years, maybe more, I didn't know where he went. The depression, he's just gone. Okay, what happened? Turns out he moved to Bahia, Brazil, to join his brother and the rest of the Arab community there. Makes tons of performances. We don't know if he recorded there. We still don't know. He might have. There are lots of very good Arab records from that time in Bahia, in Sao Paulo. Then, all of a sudden, while he's there, he gets married and has 2 kids. And then all of a sudden, he shows back up in Brooklyn. And there start being records again in the late 1940s, early 1950s by Naim Karakhan, and we don't know why. Why would he leave his wife and kids to go back to Brooklyn? And he winds up playing with lots of people. He does radio broadcasts. He's playing with all these belly dance groups that are turning up. His last recording is 1958 on a record called Jazz Sahara, made for the Riverside record label by a bassist named Ahmed Abdul Malik. Ahmed Abdul Malik was a black guy who grew up on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and was at the time Thelonious Monk's bass player, and had in the 1950s a vision of an anti-colonial jazz that would hybridize Arab and African music with American contemporary jazz. And he made a series of records, and he hires Naim Karakhan, who's a face on the scene in the Arab music world that Ahmed Abdul Malik grew up in. So, plays his ass off, by the way. If you ever hear that record, Jazz Sahara, it's online. Naim Karakhan at 58 years old, 68 years old, plays blazing solos on those records. He dies in Flushing, Queens, after having retired, heartbroken that one of his sons had died. I'm going to play you one of the post-war records that Naim Karakhan made in New York. This is an imitation of a double reed instrument called a zamir from Syria. It's a rocker. Sometimes you can find out who people are on these records. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's just a dead end, there's a cipher, there's nothing to find. And for 10 years, I've been going around playing a record called Egan by a guy named Kemeny Minas, and I've been telling audiences that we will never know who he is, that he's a cipher and a dead end, and the reason is because of his name on the records. Kemeny just means good violin player, and Minas is a very common name. And that was all there was to it, and it's a great record, and I'll tell you the story of the song, but we'll never know who he was. Until a month ago, out of the blue, two buddies of mine, crazies, record guys, Harut Arakelian, Harry Kazelian, wonderful guys who have contributed so much to this study and this work, brilliant people, send me a note, midnight. I think we found Minas. What, are you kidding me? How did you do that? They came up with this pile of documents, and by cross-referencing dates and names, definitely found that Kemeny Minas was a guy who used two different names in the United States, neither of which he was born with. Minas J. Kuzekian, which is not a real Armenian last name, it's a stage name. Kusan in Armenian is just troubadour. And Minas K. Jeremy. He was born June 15th, 1862, in Arabkir, Harput, in modern-day Turkey. He arrived in New York City October 20th, 1895, and moved to Massachusetts around November 2nd of that year. He was married, had two sons, one of whom grew up to be a violinist. The other one died in infancy. When he was naturalized, December 1st, 1906, he was living in Malden, Massachusetts, and working at the Marquis Mills Converse factory, rubber factory. Maybe you're familiar with Converse sneakers. Yes, that's where they're from. He was making rubber boots. Anyway, he recorded sessions for Victor in 1916 with Karakin Prudian, who was one of the guys that first recorded in Turkish in 1912. And then in November 1970, he and an Udis named Garabet Merjanian and an unknown Kulun player recorded 24 sides for Columbia, of which this is one of those. He died aged 58, June 3rd, 1918, 6 months after he made this record. So that's why he vanished. That's why I thought we would never know who he was. The song itself, it's Egan Havasi. And Egan is the name of a town. As it happens, it's 52 kilometers from the town where Minas grew up, was born and raised. And it's about an actual historical incident. September 15th, 1896, the Ottoman military, in revenge for a terrorist action in Istanbul, sent troops into this tiny village hundreds of miles away along the Euphrates River, this village of Egan, and massacred 1,500 people in one night and burned 2/3 of the Armenian homes in that village. So this is Minas' song about that event, written 6 months after it happened, 6 months after he arrived in the United States. He missed it by that much. And this is why 100,000 Armenians arrived in the United States between 1890 and 1924. The Ottoman military had a bunch of problems. They had ethnic problems. They had ethnic minorities breaking away. They had people complaining about the taxes because you tax the middle class when you're broke. Why are they broke? Because they're investing so much in the military. How are they investing so much in the military? They're borrowing from the big German banks to the extent that they can no longer repay the loans to the big German banks. And now they're in debt. And you raise the taxes in the middle class, and the middle class are grumping about it. And they're second-class citizens anyway, because they're Christians, and the way that the whole thing is set up. And so over 30 years, Abdulhamid II, an inhuman man and an unhappy human being, according to Lord Kinross in his biography, tries to begin systemically slaughtering Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Christians, Jews. And so they flee, and they're coming to the US in droves. So this is the situation for Minas when he records this. I think one of the best vocal performances I've ever heard in my life. I love this record.
Kurban be olayım, yar yolinde git bir çeleyim. Yazık olmuş bey yarsize, ömrü geçene. Vasiyetim budur aman de kefin biçenem ayrık. Beni de yarın çevirmeyin, yine sarsınlar. Eginin altından aman dey, geçen muratlı dağlar. Amın bindi gide, beyimi kırattır. Hilaya git, mesyaman dey, o da murattır üleyim. Tezgeram dey, tezgahım de, olma Muhammed olayım.
Will somebody tell me the time, please? Have I been talking much more than an hour? Is it past 7:30? It's past 7:30? Just a little past 7:30? Okay. I'm going to try and play you 3 more records real fast. There's, like I said at the beginning, there's so many stories I want to tell you and so many things I want to play for you. But I'll try to be quick. I talk too much. I'm sorry. Okay. So after Minas dies, the oud player that he works with, Mirjanian, goes to Troy, New York, works in a shirt collar factory. Also working in the same shirt collar factory are 2 younger guys, generation younger, who have just made it under the wire of the Johnson-Reed Act. Those 2 guys then wind up leaving Troy, moving to Philadelphia, forming their own band called the Eagle Band, the Arviz group. Violin player, oud player, percussionist. They in turn wind up as the backing band for a guy named Edward Bogosian. Bogosian was born 1900 in Constantinople. His father was an actor and acting coach. He was born and raised on the stage. He comes to the United States 1910 and is a comedian. He's a party guy. He tours around pulling faces and telling dirty jokes and being a drunk uncle at picnics. Plays in little operettas, things like this: Armenian, Turkish, Georgian, Greek. Bogosian begins recording in 1927 for a little independent record company called Pharos Records that was located on 8th Avenue, or 3rd Avenue in what was then Little Armenia in Manhattan. Pharos Records was out of a jewelry and watch repair shop run by the Vartasian brothers. And then the Depression hits, Pharos Records goes out of business. There's 10 years of silence, of nothing gets recorded in Armenian and Turkish basically in the 1930s. Then recording starts back up in the 1940s, and Bogosian starts recording again. This is Bogosian's biggest hit. And it's a song called Sude Sude. It's been recorded dozens, maybe hundreds of times in both Armenian and Turkish. It's his song, he wrote it. When I first told an Armenian buddy of mine that I liked the song, I wanted to study it, I wanted to learn about Bogosian, he goes, "What? It's a cliche. I get stuck hearing that song at every wedding, every picnic. You know, somebody plays Sude Sude. It's the Armenian Hava Nagila," he said. "And besides, Bogosian can't sing. Why would you like this record?" I said, "Well, I like the Ramones better than Led Zeppelin. I like to rock. Simple, straight, dumb, good. That's my music." And this song is all of those. The lyrics go: "I drink ouzo, I swallow appetizers. In this world I enjoy kef." Kef is the Turkish word for stoned. In Armenian it just means laid back good times. "If you don't believe it, ask me. Every misfortune has befallen me. If you folks don't believe it, ask Tommy, the drummer. Every misfortune has befallen him. Only believe in one thing, folks. Eat, drink, and be merry." And the chorus goes: "I hope you're not fooled by talk. I hope you don't trust love. In this world, everything is fake. Sude, 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 sude. It's fake, it's fake, it's fake, it's fake. Everything is fake."
Havada tekrar
So the immigrants wind up going to work in these leather factories and rubber factories and garment things, and they're working hard, and they come out and they need a bunch of things from records. They need a bunch of things from music. They need connection to home. They need to feel that they're not so lost and alone and abandoned in this strange place. They need to feel, they need to blow off some steam, get drunk, have fun, party. And that's what Edward Bogosian represents. He is that drunk uncle, let's whoop it up guy who's singing about people defrauding each other and poker playing and don't trust your husbands and all this stuff. There became a fashion in the 1940s, briefly, during the Second World War, where America embraced the idea of a diverse, multicultural society. We've always had three basic ideas of immigration. Anglo-conformity, that is, look, sound, be as much like the founding fathers and their descendants as possible, and that's American. Number two, the melting pot. We all intermix, we all intermarry, and then it all becomes one blended thing and nobody stands out much. And the third idea is plurality, multiculturalism. You're this, I'm that, we live side by side, and there's no problem. And all three of those ideas have fought against each other and worked back and forth for 150 years, as we're seeing on these records. During that brief period when multiculturalism was the fashion in the 1940s, a bunch of really good books written by immigrants about their experiences were published and became popular, big Book of the Month Club bestsellers. So I'm going to read just a sentence or two from one that was written by a guy named Salom Rizik, who was born December 1908 in a tiny village in Syria, immigrated alone to Rhode Island, April 1927, published a book for Doubleday in 1943, his only claim to fame, the only thing he ever wrote, his whole life story, called Syrian Yankee, in which he observed, "Sometimes I think democracy has succeeded too well. It has made success possible to people who did not deserve it. They found freedom here and thought it was only to fulfill their own selfish desires. They used, or rather abused, freedom to achieve power, and now they want to use that power to destroy that freedom." Salom Rizik, 1943. Another one of these books was George Papashvili, who wrote a book called Anything Can Happen. It was published in 1945 by Harper. And he talks about the scene in New York City in the 19-teens and 20s. But no matter how the work week went, the Sundays were good because we made all day the holiday and took ourselves to Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, where there was country and flowers, where we made fires and roast cubed lamb shashliks and walk on the grass and forget the factory. For one day anyway, we could enjoy to live like human beings. From 6 o'clock onward, every Sunday morning, the subway was packed full of Russians, Syrians, Greeks, Armenians, all kinds of peoples, carrying their grandpas and babies and gallon jugs and folding chairs and charcoal sacks and hammocks and samovars and lunch baskets and rugs. Everyone hurrying to their regular place in the park so they could start tea and lay out lunch to make the day last a long, long time. Okay. April 1915, a group of 3 Ottoman generals decide to solve the Armenian problem. That for 30 years there'd been this back and forth of Armenians against the Turks and the Turks against the Armenians, as the Armenians were fighting for the Turks against the Russians who were bearing down from the north. All this complicated mass is going on, but then they figure out they're going to solve the problem once and for all. And April 1915, they show up and they round up several hundred leading figures in Armenian intellectual life and take them to prison, middle of the night. You're coming with us. One of them is a composer, ethnomusicologist, priest. Gomitas Viderpit, sorry, mind thing. 2 months later, with all these leaders of the ethnicity in jail, the government then comes knocking on all the village doors. Things have gotten bad. You're coming with us. And proceed to march between 1 million and 1.5 million people southward into the Syrian desert, where they died of thirst, starvation, and exposure. This is the event for which the term genocide was invented decades later. I just read last night that Portugal has finally recognized the Armenian genocide April of this year, officially. I don't know if that's true. My country has still not, because the Turks don't want it to be called that. My country committed genocide against the Indians? I don't see what, anyway, all right, politics. So, Armenians in the US, before Johnson Reed, before they're being separated from their families, now find out from the newspaper, this hundreds of thousands of them, that not only is your house gone, your rugs, everything you left behind, everyone you ever knew is dead. And there's no home to go back to. Ever. Ever. You're stranded here. America, the factory, the place that sells you the record player and then takes your $5 and you got nothing. This place, these people. Between 1916 and 1917, a woman named Zabel Panosian recorded 11 songs. This one is called Grunk, and it was a huge hit. It sold to practically every Armenian language speaking household in the United States until 1931, when Columbia Records stopped producing records in the Armenian language. It was a huge hit. Sold many, many thousands of copies. 100,000 maybe? To the extent that, in fact, they wound up using a different take for later pressings that include the same matrix and catalog numbers and everything. They look identical. They're in a different pitch, different key, little sound effects on the other tape. Anyway, I got obsessed with this record when I first heard it. It drove me crazy that something so beautiful could have been completely left behind. And it was completely left behind. No one had written a word about the person who made this record for almost 100 years. We've done a lot of work on her. There's a book worth of material now on the life of Zabel Panosian, because this record kills me. It's one of the most extraordinary vocal performances I've ever heard in my life. Just very quickly, Zabel arrives in New York, April 1916, marries a photo engraver named Aram Sarkis Panosian, 12 years her senior. They move into Brookline, Massachusetts, outside Boston. She sings backup for the Boston Opera Company. She was trained. And then she makes this series of records, goes on tour in the late teens with Armenak Shamaradian, who was a friend and student of Gomitas, the priest, ethnographer, composer, who had been arrested preceding the genocide. They tour in benefit of the Near East Relief Fund, which was the largest philanthropic project the United States had ever seen, raising millions and millions and millions of dollars in aid of Christian and Jewish people who were affected by the events in Turkey and Syria during World War I, people who were starving and dying, Syrians, Armenians. 1920, she goes on tour in Europe. She plays all over the place, concert halls, rich people's houses. She says that she's going to look for lost family. She meets Gomitas in the insane asylum in Paris. They have an incredible meeting. He's walking around a bush talking to himself. A week before, he'd driven away the people who came to see him by beating them with his shoe. He was suffering paranoid delusions. He was post-traumatic stress syndrome, schizophrenia. It's not clear. But he was a very sick man for the rest of his life. And she was able to talk to him and ask him, how shall I sing your choral music by myself? Is that okay? And he said, my daughter, you sing it however you feel it. You know, very touching moment. She comes back to the US, she tours all over the place, goes to South America, Florida, playing for rich people. She retires basically in the 1940s. Her existing family, she had 3 children, none of them had children, so she has no direct descendants, but her existing family did not know that she ever had a musical career until I published an article on her in the Armenian Weekly in Massachusetts. And they contacted me and sent me a photo. Anyway. I love Zabel Panosian, and I love this song, and it's a great pleasure to be able to share it with you. So I hope you get something. The lyrics are addressed to a crane, Grunk. Crane, have you not news from home? Hasten not to your flock, you will arrive soon enough.
Angel of Death is coming to put an end.
Coming to put an end. So I'll just close by thanking you all very, very much for being so patient with me and for listening to all of this. If I may, I'd like to read one paragraph of I'm bringing along with me the patron saint of this talk. This is Anzia Jezierska, who wrote in 1920, the same year as the Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks was first recorded, in a book called Children of Loneliness. When the editor told me that he would give me the chance to speak to Americans out of my heart and say freely not what I ought to feel, not what Americans want me to feel, but what I actually do feel, something broke loose in me, a tightness that had held me strained like one whose fists are clenched, resisting. What had I not come to America? Outstretched arms, all of my earthly possessions tied up in a handkerchief, and all hopes of humanity singing in my heart. Had I not come to join hands with the thousands of dreamers who had gone before me in search of the golden land, as I rushed forward with hungry eagerness to meet the expected welcoming, the very earth danced under my feet. All that I was, all that I had, I held out in my bare hands to America, the beloved, prayed for land, but no hand was met to meet mine. My eyes burned with longing, seeking a comprehending glance. Where are the dreamers? Cried my heart. My hands dropped down, my gifts unwanted. I found no dreamers in America. I found rich men, poor men, educated men, ignorant men, struggling, all struggling for bread, for rent, for bodies, their brains, for the possession of things, money, power, position, their dreams forgotten. I found in this rich land man still fighting man as in the poorest part of the old country, just as the starving Romanian Jews who had nothing to eat in their homeland but herring, when they became millionaires, still ate herring from gold plates at banquets. So throughout America, the dollar fight that grew up like a plague in times of poverty, killing the souls of men, still goes on in times of plenty. I had expected to work in America, but work at the thing I loved, work with my mind, my heart, prepared for my work by education. I had dreamed of free schools, free colleges, where I could learn to give out my inmost thoughts and feelings to the world. But no sooner did I come off the ship than hunger drove me to the sweatshop, to become a hand, not a brain, not a soul, not a spirit, just a hand, cramped, deadened into part of a machine, a hand fit only to grasp and not to give. Thank you for letting me give something. I'm very grateful. Take care. Sorry.
Obrigada mais uma vez por estarem aqui. Thank you, Ian, for your work, your generosity. I feel really happy that I could open my first music curation act with as a public event with you. So I'm kind of touched. I'm going to ask you just one question, since we don't have so much time anymore. Because we had someone posing a question through streaming. So the question goes like this. In the history of the US, which was the importance or the impact of the music created by immigrants in the defense of their own rights? In the
defense of their own rights? Against the dominant culture?
Well, I think, that's the thing. The question just goes like this.
I don't know of an example of immigrants creating a recording that was in opposition, that was saying, no, it should be like this instead. It was always just, here we are, here's what I know, here's what I like. There was always a sharing thing. And then eventually, one finds many instances of immigrants drawing from what's available, and the dominant culture drawing from the immigrant sound around them. So for instance, one of the things that I'm very interested in is that a string of clubs opened up around 8th Avenue between 23rd and 41st Street in Manhattan, catering to Turkish, Arabic, Armenian, and Greek-speaking people, Oriental nightclubs. And they started out as just little coffee houses for the immigrants, but they grew and grew until there were 5 nights a week. You could go sing and dance and throw some money around and dress up nice. And over decades, it became like a cool, fashionable thing for non-immigrants to go check these places out. And it just so happens that when it became fashionable becomes about the mid-1950s. And you have jazz musicians going into clubs in Manhattan, listening to music that is modal and in time signatures other than 4/4, at the exact same time that jazz becomes modal and starts playing music in time signatures other than 4/4. Now, in the history of jazz and its literature, there is no mention, there is no story that has ever been told about the influence of these musicians on the mainstream of the Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, Sun Ra, Pharoah Sanders, John Coltrane world of this stuff, but they were clearly going and checking this stuff out. Susie Rotolo, Bob Dylan's girlfriend who's on the cover of Freewheelin', talks about going and seeing Chickanemian at dawn at the Finjan nightclub in the early 60s. Chickanemian was an Armenian oudist who was a jazz guy. He was a Charlie Parker lifestyle dude, but he was playing Near Eastern music all night long, and then at dawn, drunk off his ass, would go start playing at another club downtown, and Dylan and Susie would go listen to Armenian music and Israeli music and stuff at this little club, and she talks about it in her memoir. But it's only these little references where you begin to get the sense of how the stuff seeps into people's consciousness, and they begin to understand its value, and it enters into the mainstream of American music.
So you think I would be right by saying that most of the music was nostalgic, and it was like a link being created so that the immigrant could feel a bit of their home.
Yes.
And you told about one protest song, but
Yes.
in a way they were not singing about the rights that they should have, or because I've
No.
also researched more about the music that you've been gathering, and I felt even the tone, the lyrics, when there was a translation, spoke more to the heart, not so much to the one nation that could be tearing their links apart.
No, I would, and to call that song a song of protest, I admit is a bit of a stretch. It is certainly a complaint, if not a protest. And there are a number of these interesting complaints that come up. The biggest selling song in Turkish of the 1920s was by a Greek guy from northwestern Turkey named Achilles Poulos. Poulos had a gigantic runaway monster hit with a song that I will pronounce wrong in Turkish, Nedim Gedim Amerika'ya. But the translation is, why did I come to America? And the lyrics are, why did I come here, oh cruel, why do you aggrieve us, I wish I never came, never saw. And it sold like 100,000 copies, 100,000 copies. Every Turkish-speaking household in America had it. It was a 12-inch disc, which meant it was vastly more expensive than a normal record. And still people bought it. I've owned personally almost 10 copies of this record. It's everywhere. It's like 50 cents. You know, it's super easy to get because
Did you bring one for me?
I'm sorry. I should have. It's a song of complaint, and everybody who heard it related to it. Yeah, I know. There's got to be days when you wake up and you go, I can't believe I left home for this. And that's why the record sold like crazy. Everybody felt that way at some point. And then Poulos vanishes shortly after he makes that record in 1927. And for years, the story circulated that he was ratted out by immigration services for having made an anti-American song, and that he was deported for having made this record. Turns out that's total malarkey. He was a serious drinker. He was a really drunk guy. He had arthritis, and I think he had to give up playing because he just drank and smoked himself into oblivion. Winds up moving to Connecticut and working for a coffee roaster. He died in 1971 and is buried in Connecticut. So
It was because of the coffee, too much coffee.
maybe it was the coffee.
So-
I have not had enough, is why I didn't speak fast enough.
Before we all go, I could suggest that our audience could make a little research if they want to have a beautiful name added to the list, and that is Maria Papagica.
Oh,
Yeah? So if you want, if you can check, there's a lot of music put out by Ian's own label. I'm speaking, now I can maybe do it in Portuguese. O Ian tem a sua própria editora, Canary Records,
e se procurarem online vão encontrar muitos dos registros que ele tem compilado, e também podem ter acesso ao registro fisicamente falando, em disco. As histórias que ele nos conta aqui também aparecem nos discos, portanto são trabalhos de memórias históricas. Mais uma vez, muito obrigada por terem vindo.
Obrigado.